Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, I thought that I would talk about one of my favorite fighters, actually, of the past several years. And for those of you that don't know, the fighter that I'm going to be talking about that has been one of my favorite fighters to watch over the past several years has been Mr. Erislandy Lara. And some people might be surprised by that because Erislandy Lara, he's not necessarily to everyone the most exciting fighter to watch. But Erislandy Lara was always one of my personal favorites to watch because when I take a look at a very intelligent boxer, when I think of a very intelligent boxer, someone with a high boxing IQ, someone who has great defense and actually pretty damn decent offense as well, even though he does have certain holes in his game offensively. Some of these Cuban fighters tend to have that. But Erislandy Lara, actually, when it comes to the elite Cuban boxing school, when it comes to the fighters that we've seen come from the Cuban boxing school over the past 10 years, I've seen a multitude of them. The three ones that stood out the most to people, I think, were Yuriorkis Gamboa, Guillermo and Erislandy Lara. Let me actually say this. I believe that you can argue that Erislandy Lara was actually the most skilled fighter out of all those fighters. And that's not something that everybody would say. Because a lot of people, I would think, probably believe that Guillermo Rigondeaux was the most skilled out of all of them. In my opinion, I actually think Erislandy Lara was the most skilled out of all of them. And a certain amount of people may disagree. But Erislandy Lara in his prime, I think was one of the best fighters on the planet. I think Lara had the potential at one point in time to be a top 10 pound for pound fighter. He certainly, throughout multiple times in his career, I think would have been in my top 20 pound for pound. But I'm not really sure if I would ever say that he 100% broke that top 10 pound for pound mold, which is unfortunate because I think had certain decisions gone his way, I think that he could have became a top 10 pound for pound fighter. But it is what it is. Anyways, when it comes down to it, we're going to talk a little bit about his career, but we're also going to talk a little bit about what are his chances against some of these elite guys at 154 pounds and also at 160 pounds. Because Erislandy Lara, he's a name that will pop up here and there. I've actually had a couple of people comment his name when it comes to Charlo, when it comes to Jermall Charlo. They say that the Charlo brothers maybe should face Erislandy Lara next, which I don't think is a bad fight, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But when it comes to Erislandy Lara, before I get into all of that, I'm just going to say this, because I find it very unfortunate that Erislandy Lara, he's probably going to end up, I'm not going to say end up being forgotten, but he's probably going to end up being one of the more underrated fighters in boxing history. Lara is one of those guys that when you take a look at his record, he's lost a lot of big fights in his career, but you can pretty much argue that he actually won all the fights that he lost on paper. And I do stand by that statement. A certain amount of people may disagree. The Paul Williams fight, I think if you've seen that fight, you know for certain that that has an argument for being the worst robbery in all of boxing history. And I'm not mincing my words when I say that. That is probably the worst robbery that I've personally ever seen in boxing history. Maybe I'm forgetting some. I think Manny Pacquiao versus Tim Bradley 1 was pretty bad, but I don't even think that was as bad as Erislandy Lara versus Paul Williams. I think Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury 1 was pretty bad, and that was scored a draw, but it is what it is. That was not even as bad as the Erislandy Lara versus Paul Williams fight. That is probably the worst decision that I have ever seen in my life when it comes to boxing. I mean, at least professional boxing, so it is what it is. Anyways, man, so that's the first fight that Lara ended up losing in his career. The second loss that he suffered in his career ended up being to Saul Canelo Alvarez, who is a fighter that, I laud with a lot of praise lately because, in my opinion, Canelo Alvarez has transformed himself into being the number one pound for pound fighter. But I remember that fight just like it was yesterday, and I ended up rewatching it not too long ago, I believe a couple of weeks ago, to see if my opinion had changed of that fight, after all these years, because I score fights a little bit differently now than I did when I was in my teenage years. But when it comes down to the overall, I personally, and a certain amount of people would disagree, I personally would still give that fight to Erislandy Lara. And I know a certain amount of the Canelo Alvarez fans especially would disagree with that. If I were a judge, I personally would have given it to Erislandy Lara. But I can understand how Canelo Alvarez got the fight because Canelo was landing a certain amount of body shots, or he was chasing Lara, and maybe you can argue that in certain rounds they could have been swing rounds because Canelo Alvarez was the pressure guy, and overall Lara, maybe you can argue, was not throwing as much as he could have. So it is what it is. I kind of understand why Canelo Alvarez got the fight. Would I have scored it 9-3 like that one horrific judge did? Absolutely not. But it is what it is. And that's not the only time that judge has had horrific scoring in a fight. Take a look at the Carl Frampton-Scott Quigg fight, and there's a couple of other fights where he was absolutely horrific in scoring fights. But it is what it is. So that was a fight I think you can debate that Lara won. I personally would have given it to him. The third fight that he ended up losing in his career was against Jarrett Hurd. And out of all the fights that I think that I've seen, that's the only one that I can say, okay, maybe Lara lost that one. Or, the Canelo Alvarez one, maybe you can argue it. But in my opinion, I'm pretty decently confident in saying that I thought Lara won. The Jarrett Hurd one is the only one to where I would say, okay, maybe Erislandy Lara kind of lost that one. Because I do think that, personally, I still would have given Lara that decision. But, I understand why they gave it to Jarrett Hurd. It was a split decision. But when it comes down to it, I understand why Jarrett Hurd got the fight. He won a lot of the second half of the fight. And the knockdown, you can definitely argue, was the differential. I think had that been a Lara a few years ago when he fought Jarrett Hurd, I think Lara probably more comfortably would have won that fight. Maybe not, because Lara overall, he probably actually should have fought Jarrett Hurd a little bit more on the inside. Sometimes you want to do that with a fighter because Jarrett Hurd, he's kind of a little bit like Antonio Margarito. And that's a part of the reason why Miguel Cotto, I do believe that Antonio Margarito cheated with Miguel Cotto the first time around. But when it comes down to it, Miguel Cotto had to make some adjustments in the second fight and actually fight Antonio Margarito a little bit on the inside because even without the hand wraps, Antonio Margarito was still a pretty decently hard puncher. So Miguel Cotto still had to make adjustments in that rematch, and he actually had, even though he was moving around quite a bit, he did have to fight on the inside a little bit with Antonio Margarito and push him off. And that's kind of what Erislandy Lara had to do in that fight against Jarrett Hurd. He should have smothered himself a little bit against Hurd and tried to fight him on the inside a little bit, maybe try to push him off a little bit. Kind of smother, you're the guy overall that's smaller. It's going to be a bit harder for Jarrett Hurd to always hit you on the inside unless you're always backing up, and that's kind of what Erislandy Lara did. So, not the 100% best game plan there, but Lara is a fighter that likes to move around. So, those are the 3 losses in his career. And in my opinion, I probably would have scored all those fights for Erislandy Lara. But it's just unfortunate for Erislandy Lara because he's at a point in his career now to where he's about 39 years old, I believe. I think he's 39 years old. He recently just beat Thomas Lamana in a middleweight bout. I believe his first ever middleweight bout. And I believe he ended up winning the WBA regular middleweight title, which means maybe later on he could end up facing, I think, that one Japanese fighter. I think his name is Ryuto Murata, I think is his name. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Someone would have to correct me if I'm wrong. But when it comes down to it, man, if you had to ask me the question, because there's been certain people that ask me this question, like, what do you think about an Erislandy Lara versus Jermall Charlo fight? What do you think about an Erislandy Lara versus Jermall Charlo fight? What do you think about Erislandy Lara versus these guys? I've had certain people ask me this, and Erislandy Lara being one of my favorite fighters to watch overall. Now, once again, I'm not a fan of any of these fighters, but I do have certain styles that I prefer over others, and Erislandy Lara certainly is a style that I like to watch. Which some people may not understand, but I always thought he was great at the sweet science. And when I just take a look at it, I don't think that Lara would beat any of those guys at this point in time in his career. I think it's unfortunate, but when I take a look at Erislandy Lara at this point in time in his career, I don't think that he has the same legs. I don't think that he has the same stamina. I don't think that he has the same reflexes, the same speed that he used to. Now, when you take a look at the skill set is still there. He still is a very accurate puncher. He can move around a little bit, and he's still very hard to hit. But in certain fights, like against a Jarrett Hurd, or if he were to face a Jermall Charlo, if he were to face a Demetrius Andrade, if he were to face a Gennady Golovkin, even 39-year-old Gennady Golovkin at this point in time, maybe he could get away with beating Gennady Golovkin, just because Gennady Golovkin is somewhat in the same boat. I believe he's also 39 years old, the same age as Lara. And you can tell that his reflexes have gotten down. And Golovkin has always been a little bit hittable, and it's even more exploitive now that he's gotten old in age. So maybe Lara can beat him off of that. But when I think about a Demetrius Andrade, I think once upon a time Lara would have beat him. I think peak Lara, in my opinion, is a technically better fighter than Demetrius Andrade and Jermall Charlo. I think a prime Lara beats both Demetrius Andrade and beats Jermall Charlo. That's my opinion. I think overall he's a better technical fighter. I think he's a smarter fighter. I think he's less sloppy than the less of them, and I think he gets hit less than the less of them. That's what I personally think about Erislandy Lara in his peak form. But this is not peak Erislandy Lara. This is a fighter to where he does not have great legs at this point in time in his career. A fighter that used to rely a lot on his mobility and his movement and his footwork. You're talking about a fighter overall that gets hit a significant more amount at this point in time in his career than what he used to. And even though is a decent offensive fighter when he wants to be, is not an A-grade offensive fighter in certain terms, if you wanted to say that. Does have certain holes in his game offensively, so you certainly could say that. I don't see Erislandy Lara beating any of these elite guys, to be honest with you. That's just my opinion. Maybe if you were to face a Jermall Charlo, maybe he would be able to beat him. But another problem with Erislandy Lara is this, and he's kind of always had a little bit of a problem with this in his career. There are certain fights to where he just does not throw enough. Now, he's always had a little bit of a problem with that, but I've seen certain fights to where Lara did throw enough overall to get the decision or to get the fight. Like against Alfredo Ngulu, when he ended up stopping him, and when he pretty much dominated Austin Trout. So, there's been certain fights where Lara did not throw enough. There's been certain fights where he did throw enough. But especially at this point in time in his career, Lara may not get absolutely embarrassed against these guys, but Lara, because of his legs being somewhat gone at this point in time in his career, and his stamina going a little bit down, and his reflexes and his speed going a little bit down, I could see Lara losing these fights just because he gets, just because he gets outpaced by some of these guys. And that's why, in my opinion, even though Erislandy Lara used to be a very great A-class fighter, and used to be one of the top fighters in the world, in my opinion, I think at this point in time in his career, I think that he more than likely would probably lose to all of them. That's just my personal opinion on it. So, it is what it is. I think it's very unfortunate because I don't think Lara is ever going to get the credit that he truly deserved in his career. I think Lara had the potential to become the best at 154 pounds. Now, I guess at one point in time you would say that he was the best at 154 pounds officially when Canelo Alvarez left. But it is what it is. He even had the potential, maybe, to become the best at 160 pounds one day. I think Lara had that much potential. But unfortunately, and this is kind of what I call the Cuban curse, it just usually does not end up that way for them. I can't really name a lot of Cuban fighters in the history of boxing that usually were remembered in a great light. It's just unfortunate for them, what they usually have to go through. They usually cannot get a great deal of those big fights. There's really not a lot of fighters that wanted to face them. So it is what it is. Even certain fighters that are alleged boogeymans, like Demetrius Andrade, I don't think Demetrius Andrade really ever wanted to face Erislandy Lara. Now, allegedly he wanted to face Erislandy Lara, but then when Lara actually called him out, Demetrius Andrade didn't seem too serious about facing him. And a lot of people actually don't remember that, but that's what happened. Anyways, when it comes down to the overall, I find it very unfortunate, but when I take a look at Erislandy Lara at this point in time in his career, I don't see him beating any of those big guys. I think he can give Jermall Charlo problems. I think he can give Jermall Charlo problems. I think he can give Demetrius Andrade problems. I think he can give all those fighters problems. I don't think he can beat any of those fighters at this point in time in his career. That's just my opinion. It's very unfortunate. I think what Lara's next move should be, if he can get a fight, try to get the WBA title holder, Ryota Murata. I think that would be the best fight. And that would be if he wins that fight, and I would actually favor Lara in that fight, I believe. I would have to watch a little bit more of Murata, but when it comes down to it, I believe Lara more than likely would win that fight. If Lara can win that fight, I think he would at least be remembered a little bit in a better light in his career, because then he would be a two-weight division champion, and he would be remembered in a better light. So I'm hoping that's what Lara kind of does for his career. But we'll see what happens. I don't really know what Lara's next move is going to be. I'm not really sure if he's going to get any of these big fights. I hope maybe that he does get one, but when it comes down to it, if he does get one of these big fights, like a Gennady Golovkin, like a Jermall Charlo, or a Demetrius Andrade, especially at 160 pounds, do I think he's going to beat any of those guys? I think maybe he has a chance against Gennady Golovkin, because Gennady Golovkin, his mortality is kind of going down the drain a little bit, just like Erislandy Lara's. But Demetrius, Andrade, and Jermall Charlo right now are in their prime. They're at their absolute best. I don't see Lara at this point in time in his career beating either of those guys. So it is what it is. But that's pretty much my opinion on this situation. We'll see what happens. I think it's unfortunate that Lara has not gotten, even more big fights in his career. And some of the big fights that I thought he could have potentially won were kind of taken away from him. But it is what it is. Anyways, when it comes down to the overall, that's really my opinion on this situation. That's my opinion about Erislandy Lara, about him potentially beating some of these big guys. In my opinion, I just think that it's a little bit too late in his career. And unfortunately, I just think Lara is always going to end up as one of those fighters that is a little bit underappreciated and, does not receive as much credit as he probably deserved. But it is what it is. Anyways, that's really about it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.